Well, greetings, you curious, you courageous Herle Burlyites. The data tells me a good lot of you who tune into this podcast hold two simultaneously pod affiliations. You self-identify as a Herle Burlyite, and you are also fully, completely, irretrievably accursed. Which means you probably heard us on this week's Curse of Politics speculating about the politics surrounding the fall economic statement dropping on Tuesday. Today we're taking a deeper dive into the policy ideas we think we're either going to hear or should be hearing. With me to do that is our wickedly smart policy panel, now making their third triumphant appearance here on the Herle Burly. Tyler Meredith, Dr. Jennifer Robson, and Sean Speer. Let me remind you of their bona fides. Tyler is the former head of fiscal and economic policy for Prime Minister Trudeau and Ministers of Finance Chrystia Freeland and Bill Morneau. Today he's a founding partner at Meredith Bosencool Policy Advisors. Jennifer's held senior roles in policy development and research with the federal government. She's now program director and associate professor of political management at Carleton University. Her primary areas of research are the intersection of household finances and the design and implementation of social policy. Sean is a former senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper. Today, he's assistant professor of public policy at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He is also a founder and editor-at-large at the most excellent thehub.ca. So, hell of a lot of policy chops in the room today. Sean, Tyler, Jennifer, delighted to have you on the Herle Burly. Thanks for doing it.
Thanks for having us back.
Glad to be back.
So, Tyler, just warm us up here a little bit. What is it like putting a fall economic statement together? Who's involved? How long does it take? When was this thing put to bed?
Well, what's different about the fall economic statement compared to a normal budget is that it's actually the time in which the Department of Finance gets to, and the Prime Minister's office gets to define their key priorities as opposed to being responsive or having to respond primarily to proposals that are coming in from other departments. So this is their time to shine in terms of the things that they want to talk about that they feel they haven't had an opportunity to do so. It's a much more condensed process than the budget. It typically runs kind of from the end of September to the end of October in terms of decision making. So it's rather quick. In this case, because we won't have it until early next week, my understanding is that they're just in the process of finalizing it right now. But that longer process also reflects, as you know, David, there's been a turnover of some staff in the last little while. And
new deputy and a new chief of staff, right?
That's right. Yeah. And so, you need to kind of get the new deputy, the new chief of staff, and some of the new staff in the office kind of all on the same page because it's their first opportunity working together in developing a quasi-budget document. I'll just end by saying what's interesting about the fall economic statement is it is the opportunity to show the kind of forward economic forecast. And this time is really interesting because we are getting better growth than we expected earlier in the budget, but probably we will see that the financial structure of the fiscal framework is worse, partly because revenues have not been coming in as strong as expected.
Can I just jump in on that, David, because I similarly worked on a handful of fall economic statements, and I would say the principal decision for the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, as Tyler says, in late summer, early fall, is the economic fiscal statement merely going to be an update to the government's revenue and expenditure projections, or is it going to be, as it's often described in Ottawa, a mini budget? That is to say, also outline incremental new policies. The Harper government went the route of straight updates after 2008. I don't know if you remember, the 2008 fall economic statement didn't go so well. It helped to precipitate a pretty big crisis. And so I think after that, the government was pretty gun shy and, in fact, oftentimes released the fall economic statement in a break week in November to essentially signal to parliamentarians, investors, and others that this was in effect, to kind of downplay the fall economic statement, to diminish this idea that it had to be a mini budget. So I think at a kind of fundamental level, what I think everyone is looking to see on Tuesday is this more a straight update. Do we learn, as Tyler says, about revised growth projections and revised fiscal projections? Or is the government going to use it to outline incremental policies to address some of the issues that Canadians are telling us in polls they're concerned about?
Jennifer, what about a third option? What about a third option? Back in the day when Paul Martin was the Minister of Finance, we used these things not as either one of those other two things, but we used this thing as a communications exercise. We used it as a vehicle when we could command the center stage and set up the budget. The fall economic statement was when we would tell people what the budget was going to address, right? And let that debate flesh out over the ensuing months until the budget was a no surprises consensus type of document. Do they do that anymore?
Well, look, every fall economic statement, every budget is also a comms document and a comms exercise to some degree. I was also just reflecting on the question of has it been put to bed yet or not? And it reminded me, so David, back when it was, the Paul Martin days, it was a paper document that had to get released. And that meant you had to worry about things like layout and translation and printing and all the rest of it. So it meant you actually had to put it to bed a lot earlier. Whereas now it's like, it's a PDF, whatever, we can edit it. So look, yes, it's always a comms document. I think that it's possible that this particular fall economic statement is going to have to do a little bit of all of these things. On the one hand, sort of set the expectations, right? Do some expectations management with regards to what is the current state of the fiscal framework, which of course that also sets the frame for expectations around the budget in the springtime. But it also seems like they've been out, talking about a couple of different things that are kind of hot topics. And I think it would be a little weird to have been doing some of this pre-positioning, right, on housing in particular. We got a bit of a sneak peek in terms of the results of the spending review. So I think it would be a little odd if they were silent on those issues next week.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's put aside their pre-positioning, Jennifer, and let me stay with you.
Okay.
And before we get into the political economy of this, which we'll spend most of our time talking about, I just want to talk about pure policy for a second. If you were designing this thing, what would it be about?
Okay. I would say that right now it would be about providing some reassurance to voters, consumers, investors with regards to sort of the forward path, both for the government agenda, but also just for sort of economic and fiscal management more generally. I spent some time a couple of days ago taking a look at the Bank of Canada's data on what is CPI actually doing, but then what people think CPI is doing. And there is a significant gap, right? So in the States, they've started talking about this issue of the vibe session, right? In other words, look, are things a little, kind of tenuous, right? Is growth enormously strong? No, it's stronger than we had been expecting, right? We don't seem to be right on the verge of a recession. But at the same time, that issue of people's sentiment, their sense of confidence, that is real, right? And I think there is something there that does need to be addressed.
Cool. If I can
Sean, what would you say
on your question? One thing I can tell you that Jim Flaherty really cared about was he didn't have a deficit phobia per se, but what he did have, David, was a phobia of the numbers worsening year over year. He wanted to present to Canadians, to investors, to markets, a consistent trajectory down. And to the extent to which this government is concerned about that, it seems to me the fiscal update needs to signal a renewed commitment to deficit reduction. As Tyler said, most people are anticipating that the deficit for this year is actually the projection is going to worsen relative to the budget.
Why does that matter, Sean?
Well, I think it matters for a couple of reasons. One, the political, and then the second is the kind of economic or fiscal policy point of view. And conservatives oftentimes talk about balanced budgets, and I'm sure Tyler will tell you that 0 isn't a magic number. But it is a useful anchor. It creates a set of parameters around economic and fiscal policy. And now, having broken that anchor, I think there's a kind of growing concern on Bay Street and elsewhere that the government's fiscal policy is adrift. And if the revised deficit for this year is as high as some people are speculating, we could be looking at a deficit that, on a cyclically adjusted basis, is the largest since 1995. And so, it seems to me, I don't envision a world where the government...
But much smaller than 1995.
In absolute term, I'm afraid I don't know what you mean.
Well, I mean, in relative terms to the size of the economy, we're not.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. But moving in the wrong direction. And so you asked, if I was advising the finance minister on priorities, it seems to me I would be trying to follow the Jim Flaherty rule. And if not able to show a declining deficit year over year, setting out some concrete details on how you're going to get back to that glide path.
Tyler, how about you? You're not trying to get reelected. You're just bringing in an economic plan. What's in it?
A couple things. I think number one, to go back to what Jen said earlier about consumer expectations, that is a real issue because the consumer is starting to stall in the economy right now. And the consumer right now thinks that inflation in Canada is much higher than it is in the rest of the world. The reverse is actually true, but people don't feel it. And we're not going to convince them with a bunch of stats. So I think the question would be, are there things that we can put in the window that will actually show people that the government is able to help reduce some of the pressures that exist on your household budget, and some of those might be things like investments in housing. We've successfully prosecuted that argument within childcare, but we've not been able to prosecute that argument in other places. So I'd be looking to, are there things that we can do to do that? And I would be looking at, for example, like, should we now, given some of the recent debate about what's happened with the carbon tax, should we be looking at things around energy poverty, right? Because that is a real issue that is driving both personal frustrations and frankly also consumer decisions. And again, if we can't get in front of the psychology of the consumer, we may accidentally find ourselves in a recession, even though we actually are on a path to avoid a recession. The second thing I would say is I think we actually have to start thinking about how we address climate change in ways that don't just rely on one tool. We've put a lot of emphasis on carbon pricing in the last number of years. That is the most efficient, most effective way to do it. But clearly there are limits to how far we can go on that front. And I think we need to be actively thinking about what do we do on climate adaptation? What do we do about helping people with resiliency? How do we address floods and wildfires? Because those are increasing risks in people's lives. And I think increasingly government has to find a way to show that they are able to either reduce costs in people's household budgets or reduce risk.
Excellent. Okay. So thanks for that. But now, regardless of what any of you think, the Minister of Finance the other day said the budget's going to be, the fall economic statement is going to be a responsible fiscal plan that focuses on affordability and housing supply. Sean, what do you think of those objectives and what do you think that might look like?
My gut, for what it's worth, is it, in a lot of ways, David, repackages what the government has done in recent months. I think there's a sense in government circles, which I think in a way is a consequence of the ambition of this government, the kind of frenetic pace of this government, that when I was in Ottawa, David, we used to have this line. In some ways, it dates me. When we thought about fall economic statements or budgets, we used to say Peter Manchevich can only say three things when he reports on the budget that night. What are the three things he's going to do? The problem with this government is every budget has like 1,000 things, and so
I will admit that's true. That's a problem.
And so my gut is we may not see a lot of incremental measures with respect to housing. What I think we'll probably see is the government trying to build a narrative around some of the steps that Sean Fraser has taken since he's become minister to effectively try to neutralize or even capture that issue from the Conservatives. On the first part, the part about responsible, sustainable public finances, the truth is I don't see a scenario where the government kind of changes who it is and how it thinks about these issues. And so, while I don't envision a world necessarily where we see a large scale increase in the deficit, I don't think it's going to take my advice either and start to take further action to try to get back to the deficit track that it was on in last March budget.
So let me get something out there, way out there, final frontier out there. I'm a space guy, not a Star Wars guy, a Star Trek guy. In Herle world, beam me up, Scotty beats may the force be with you, all to hell. So I'm pretty chuffed to talk about a giant leap in network technology our presenting sponsor TELUS is investing in. They're literally beaming up signals to satellites and back down to Earth to deepen our digital connectivity. TELUS has just partnered with Canada's own TerraStar Solutions, under the Strigo brand name to successfully test satellite connectivity for mobile voice calls, and in another partnership with Skylo, a non-terrestrial network service provider, to send text messages and connect to Internet of Things devices. Stuff like smart thermostats, connected healthcare monitors, smart agriculture equipment, and more. This is fresh and transformational stuff. The trial happened just last month. The thinking is it's going to fill several of the existing gaps in mobile networks. Among other things, customers in their most remote areas, like hikers and campers, will suddenly have mobile access no matter where they are, even on an exposed rock face at 12,000 feet. It'll provide backup connectivity so emergency services are never out of reach, even when natural disasters impact networks and damage cell towers. It's going to dramatically improve how massive industries do their remote fieldwork and monitor critical operations like forestry, energy, and scientific research. And it'll deliver real-time data, including temperature, water, and site-specific information to farmers to improve decision-making and sustainability in remote agriculture. It's another example, Herle Burlyites, of what we've been on about here these last weeks. TELUS investing to drive innovation, social purpose, and the Canadian economy. That's how they like to put it anyway. Staying with the theme, I'd say it a little differently, so we all live long and prosper. So, Tyler, I am certain that if you ask Canadians, they will say that they would like a responsible fiscal plan. I am also certain that they do not want any tax increases or any spending cuts. So what does a responsible fiscal plan mean?
Well, so this is where telling the story about what you're trying to achieve is probably just as important as actually how you achieve it, right? In the sense that to the point that Sean raised, it's true. The government's kind of in a bit of a pickle right now because last year's deficit actually was better than expected. So they were supposed to be at about $45 billion. It actually fell to about $36 billion. This year's deficit is supposed to be $40 billion. It'll probably be somewhere in the range of 40 to 45. And so that even though year to year, we're actually not all that far off of where we should be, we go down and then we go up. And that doesn't create a sense of continuity and plan. And so I think, there may be an opportunity here for Minister Freeland to describe what is my fiscal anchor, other than it just goes down sequentially year after year after year. If you can't do that, are you targeted in on something around year 3, year 4, year 5 of the fiscal track that you're trying to adjust for? Is it deficits below 1% of GDP? Is it deficit zero? I don't think it'll be deficit zero, but I think they could potentially redefine the problem as being deficits below 1% of GDP and continuing to be the best in the G7, both on a deficit basis and a debt basis. And to be honest with you, from the perspective of what matters to how the government should be assessed in terms of financial markets, that's actually probably what matters, because Canada doesn't really have a public debt problem. We have a household debt problem. We don't have a public debt problem. And I think she just has to set goalposts that she can credibly try to achieve. The challenge is that the goalpost she set before of trying to ensure that the deficit continues to go down on a sequential basis probably is going to be very hard to achieve this year. And just to your point, David, I would just say that if we look over the last number of years, what's been interesting is, there's this debate about does Canada have a spending problem, right? And there's this question of, is Canada's fiscal policy at odds with our monetary policy? Since 2021, federal expenses, at least as if you assess them on the basis of data from StatsCan, are actually tracking downwards because the government has very effectively taken off all of that COVID spending. Provincial expenses are actually starting to tick up in a meaningful way. And so, if we have a spending problem, it's not exactly at the federal level. There are issues at the federal level, but we are seeing more problems probably at the provincial level.
Jennifer, where are you at on the importance of the deficit? There isn't a lot of political pressure for the government to do this, certainly not from its potential voters. So what pressure are they feeling to look more responsible on the fisc?
Yeah, so actually, okay. I agree with what both Sean and Tyler have said in terms of you need an anchor, and I think that it's fundamentally a political question as to whether.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
She has dropped that language and refused to use the term anchor for a long time, I think, hasn't she? She moved to guardrails, and I don't know really what that means in this context, but
all I can think of is bowling, where it's like, no, you can't actually get the ball into the anyway. I don't know if that's the right metaphor. Yeah, look, I think fundamentally, whether you want to call it a guardrail or a goalpost, whatever you want to call it, it's a fundamentally political question as to whether you think it should be zero or whether you think basically the concern should be that the economy needs to be growing faster than your deficit, right? And that, whether it's a numerical value or ratio between those two things, or if what you just fundamentally want to see is a downward trend, right, in terms of the share of government debt and deficit relative to your economy. Where I actually think she's got more pressures, because I agree with Tyler, like an awful lot of, and if you read the PBO's latest fiscal update, they're pretty clear that, as a matter of fact, assuming no new spending, right, things kind of level out, right? And as long as
you may not want to assume, Jen.
right, assuming no new spending and assuming things sunset as expected, then we're kind of fine. And that's the assumption, right, is the issue. And so where I actually think there's the bigger pressure.
Those are the projections for 20 years that led up to 1995, by the way.
And so
that is the budgeting system that led to 1995.
Yeah. So where I think actually that the government is facing pressure is obviously on the housing file, right, in terms of doing housing supply. It's the question of new money versus how much can you get away with leveraging the existing resources that you got, right? Which is more the sort of the conservative strategy is no new money, but a whole whack of conditionality on what you're going to do with that money, which we can get into because I have thoughts on that. There's the question of responding to premiers who are saying we want a new infrastructure program because the existing one, all of that money has been allocated, it's spoken for. So in terms of addressing some of the issues that Tyler was raising, like climate adaptation, if you want to invest in those projects, invest in those climate mitigation measures, like you need a new program for that. There's the question of the pressure the government may be feeling. I don't know. Maybe they've decided they've taken a stance and that's it with regards to extending the CEBA repayment, which is sort of this one last lingering program from COVID. And, premiers have sort of said like, hey, we want you to do this too. There's the issue of pharmacare, which is, the NDP is saying super important for supply and confidence. And then last but not least, we're still all waiting for the details, the implementation details of the $80 billion in tax credits that they announced in the budget, for all the clean tech and clean energy stuff. And the reason I raised that as a potential cost pressure is because the experience in the States has been the comparable tax measures there ended up, the projections are so far, they're going to be oversubscribed, right? That they're going to cost more than what was originally projected. So that's kind of where I see some of the challenges that they're going to be facing, right? Is there are these external pressures, which each of themselves are either reasonable from a political standpoint, in many cases actually have a good policy rationale behind them, but would push them off of the current trajectory, right?
Can I just pick up on? Sorry,
ahead,
can I just pick up on what Jen said there for a second? Because I think there's an important point, which is the composition of spending is just as important as the total amount of spending. And if you go back to COVID, the government very effectively made a case that it was on the side of people, and the proof point of that was, as you'll remember, $8 out of $10 of COVID was funded by the federal government. But they haven't found a way to explain the way in which they are investing right now and spending at levels that some people think are too high, but in ways that are smart in order to address inflation and the supply chain problems that we face in our economy. And I think if they can get to a place that better articulates the actual composition of spending is actually reducing inflationary pressures in the economy, which is also good for your pocketbook and good overall for ensuring that businesses and consumers can make the right choices going forward. That could actually have a really important effect, but they haven't yet found an ability to say, for example, 80% of the new money that we're spending is on supply-oriented things like housing and infrastructure.
I would just make
go ahead,
just a bigger picture point that I've been thinking about for a while, and it relates to both Jennifer and Tyler's observations, and particularly this question about the composition of spending. If you think about it this way, David, we're kind of living in a world of Stephen Harper's tax rates and Justin Trudeau's spending preferences, and that gap is going to grow because of some of the issues that Jennifer has raised. Growing demands to increase military spending, The inevitable or inexorable rise in spending related to aging demographics, the need to match at some level the Americans on climate policy. And I would just say in parentheses that doesn't change for a Poilievre-led government. In fact, there's a case, it's an even greater imperative because, of course, he's removing carbon prices from our mix of policies and is going to have to offset that with some combination of regulations and subsidies. So that's a very long way of saying, with all of the caveats that we're not in a fiscal crisis yet and our position is relatively strong, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that at some point we're going to have something of a reckoning. Are we prepared to pay for the size of government that we want? And some people would argue we need. Or are we prepared to reset our expectations about the size and scope of government to bring them in line with the rate of tax that we're prepared to pay? As long as we're paying Stephen Harper's tax rates and reflecting Justin Trudeau's spending preferences, there is going to be this inevitable gap that at some point is going to have meaningful effects, whether it's in the growing share of public expenditures dedicated to interest payments, which I would just observe continues to rise, or some bigger event that will force that kind of reckoning.
So, building on that, and really leapfrogging off something that Jennifer said, which is one of the things that is not in the minister's litany about the fall economic statement, it wasn't in any of your comments about the fall economic statement, is growth. And my understanding is that economists don't expect our economy on a GDP per capita basis to ever grow again. and that we have a declining standard of living, and we'll continue to have a declining standard of living unless we change the economic growth rates. Tyler, you are disagreeing with what I'm saying vigorously, so correct me.
So that's that stat which has flown around a lot of places, which is premised on a paper that the OECD put out. I think there's a bunch of reasons why we should be very suspicious of that forecast that Canada's growth will be among the worst going forward. For a couple of reasons. One is if you look at recent history, Canada's labor productivity rate has actually increased faster than the trend rate that's assumed in the OECD paper. And that's important because it suggests that actually we do better than people assume in a long run forecast. Number two is it depends what you want to use as your metric, right? So there's some research that would suggest that if you look rather than GDP per capita, if we tried to look at, for example, what is GDP per employed person, because at the end of the day, as demographics change, right, the growth that we create in the economy is going to be dependent on who's employed. Canada actually since 2015 is the second best in the G7 on that metric. And the US obviously has gone gangbusters, and there's a reason why the US always goes gangbusters. And we probably should think about how do we tug at the United States in a way to get some of that growth. But we're doing okay on that front. The second point I would make is there's been recent research that suggests, so how does Canada compare on a total factor productivity basis to the United States across different industries? And one of the interesting conclusions that some new researchers have found is that if you control for the size of our energy sector, because we spend a lot of money taking out some pretty expensive resources relative to our global competitors, on every other industry on a total factor productivity basis, we actually do just as well as the United States. And so that's mind-blowing if you think about all of the 30 years of productivity discussion we've been having in this country that kind of says we suck, we've pushed a bunch of incentives that haven't worked, and there's nothing really that we can do about it. So I say this, David, because I'm a little bit more of an optimist.
Excellent. Sean, do you have a take on that?
All right, can I jump in? Is that okay?
Of course.
Just to build? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So just a couple of things here. So, agree with Sean that this question before around, Justin Trudeau's spending on Stephen Harper's tax rates is a dialogue, right? That needs to happen at some point, right? We've been putting off a question of a federal tax review for a while. But I would just say this is that we're not talking about an order of magnitude that is ridiculous, right? We're talking about sort of tax rates that are, or total government revenues that are somewhere in the neighborhood of 13, 14% of GDP and spending that is about 15. So closing that gap is like probably not impossible here, whichever direction you want to move, right?
Right.
In terms of the OECD paper, just to build on what Tyler was saying, okay, another thing about that paper that drives me completely insane is that when you read it and you look at what does the OECD then say countries should do in terms of boosting their growth, they say things like spend on infrastructure, increase your labor force participation rates, have measures that specifically bring in more women into the workforce, especially women with young kids, by investing in early learning and care. And so anyway, and there's a couple of other examples in there, but it's sort of like, okay, so there are probably methodological questions about their diagnostic in terms of the reliability of these long-term projections, right? There's a lot of fuzziness in terms of the how far it could go. But more importantly, it's sort of like, and then when they say, so what should you do in terms of your policy response? It's like, this is what we're kind of already doing. Like, anyway, so sorry, I just needed to hack.
All right, Sean, bail me out here because I'm getting unfairly maligned. I did not bring up the OECD paper, and I did not compare Canada to other jurisdictions. I thought it was a pretty broad consensus among economists that growth in the Western world is going to be very slow and low for the foreseeable future, not just in Canada, but everywhere.
We've been losing a percentage point of average annual growth decade over decade since the 1970s. And I take Tyler and Jennifer's point that there may be methodological problems with some of these papers, but I don't think that would negate the fact that all things being equal, we'd prefer to be growing at 3% rather than 2%. George Will has this great line, David, where he says something like, the difference between 2% and 3% isn't 1%, it's 50%. Right. And I would say on that front, I do think things are moving in a good direction, almost like intellectually, I would say, in terms of how we're thinking and talking about public policy as it relates to growth. And I would say that's across the spectrum. For the better part of the previous decade prior to COVID, there was a lot of focus on demand, through extraordinary monetary policy, through large-scale deficit spending. I think we collectively placed a lot of emphasis on the demand side of the economy. And I think what we discovered during this period of inflation is that we failed to spend enough time thinking about the supply side of the economy. And I don't know why. I think that may be because the supply side lexicon and thinking, became associated with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher or something like that. And people had a kind of instinctive recoil. But what we're seeing on both the left and the right, obviously different emphasis, different use of policy instruments, but a recognition that we need to place a greater emphasis on the supply side. It's not lost on me that Minister Freeland said in an interview in the past day or so that one thing she's focused on is supply, supply, supply. I think that's the right way to think about trying to grow the economy faster than it's currently projected, even on the margins, because I think fundamentally, not only is that good for the fiscal picture, I think actually at kind of a philosophical level, it's good for the society as a whole. It discourages the kind of zero-sum thinking and polarization and negativity about the future that we're witnessing in polling, not just in Canada, but across the Western world. A faster growing economy is, generally speaking, a happier society.
I'm just going to build on that because I think Sean makes an excellent point. The US economy today, after COVID, is bigger on a real inflation-adjusted basis than people were projecting that it would be in 2023 in 2019. That's like mind-blowing, right? When you consider that in the period between those 4 years, we've had a global pandemic and a whole bunch of chaos in the United States. Now, for most of the other G7 countries, we're kind of around the forecast for 2023 or just slightly below. But even still, that's also kind of remarkable when you consider that we've gone through massive shocks and yet still come out the other side just as big, even on an after inflation basis. And so I just say this, David, because I think we've learned a little bit through the last 3 or 4 years about doing some extraordinary things with policy levers. And it might actually be that because we did those extraordinary things, especially on how to think about the supply side and how to think about the way in which you maintain income in an economy, that contributed to why we have done so well.
So let me tell you a few things about trains. We've all seen them roll through a crossing or racing through a forest or field, and they seem pretty similar. Hundreds of boxcars, or maybe those cylindrical tank cars, a mile long or longer, hauled behind a locomotive or two. Fact is, though, trains are remarkable pieces of engineering. They have to be. They move just about everything. Cars, minerals, grain, petroleum, engine parts, heavy machinery, manufactured stuff, food. I could go on. In fact, I will go on. As I might have mentioned a few times on this pod, trains do their job very efficiently indeed, given the low friction physics of steel wheels on steel tracks. The only method of transport more efficient than a train is a ship at sea. And when I say they move everything, I do mean everything. Our sponsor CN moves tons of margarine, boxcars of French fries, shipments of wood pulp. No problem at all. One CN customer regularly ships high-quality windmills from Quebec to Texas, a state which, despite its reputation for consuming fossil fuel, leads the nation in wind energy generation. CN's expert crews figured out a way to efficiently accommodate the big turbines and their giant blades. There are hopper cars for grain, tank cars for just about any liquid, intermodal cars that can be directly transferred to ships or trucks, gondola cars for minerals, flat cars for steel and lumber and aluminum, cars that stack up automobiles, insulated cars to keep cargo from freezing, and reefer cars to keep fresh food from spoiling and frozen food from melting. There are special cars for logs, low cube cars for potash and fertilizer, waterproof cars, open hopper cars for metals, and a fleet of what railroaders call government hoppers, those cars with the huge familiar Canada logo emblazoned beside a stylized stalk of wheat. Here's something else I may have said a few times here. CN moves the economy. Without trains, everything stops. So the next time you see a train roll past, go ahead and marvel. Okay, I might be laying it on a little thick there, but moving everything? Man, that's impressive. Okay, can I ask you about affordability? Because it's obviously the primary political pressure that the government faces. And, you know, it started off as inflation. And now it's kind of a pincer move because inflation's still around on things that really matter to people like housing and food. But now interest rates are an issue. So affordability, the cure is now part of the affordability challenge. What can the government really materially do on this that it hasn't already done? Wow. Okay. So nothing is the answer.
No,
nothing is the answer.
So, all right, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think the key thing is we've got to actually address the cost of financing, right? And so in the housing space, there is a very real need for government to step in to provide some cost certainty around financing for developers, in part because we're not going to unlock the supply that we need to build purpose-built rental or to build affordable housing if we're not able to actually keep those projects going. There are lots of projects that are on the books that are now economical because of other policy changes government has made, but they can't actually get to project because the cost of financing have changed so substantially in the last year. I mean, David, I think your interview with Jennifer Keesmaat recently proved that out, right? Just how in her own project in the last year, things have changed so fundamentally. So
but Jesus, Tyler, I'm going to stop you because they're not going to get enough houses built between now and 2025 to fundamentally change the affordability equation.
No, that's true. But I'm just saying if the first goal is to not make things worse, we've got to be able to step in and actually ensure that we can keep supply expanding, because if we don't, we actually will have a second bout of inflation, right? And this is what's really risky in the housing sector right now, is as we continue to raise interest rates, we're making mortgage costs more expensive for people, and we're restricting the ability to build more rental supply, which also means that we'll have a feedback loop of inflation back into rental. And so we've got to break that cycle fundamentally. Part of it means the Bank of Canada probably has to ease off of interest rate hikes, but the government should also think about whether it can step in and do some things around cost certainty, around loan financing and so forth, and potentially also look at whether there are changes around amortizations. I mean, what's interesting is there's been this big debate between the superintendent of financial institutions about what is the right set of rules we should have around governing banks around risks associated with mortgages. in a sense, we're trying to apply tightening as people are going through mortgage renewals. That's important, but at the same time, if we overdo that, and we expose people to huge increases in mortgage costs that they are not ready for, we are going to create a stall in the economy and potentially create another broader financial stress.
What's the numbers, Tyler? Something, if I recall correctly, there's just going to be this massive spike in refinancing.
25, 26.
Yeah.
25, 26.
So that has economic consequences, as Tyler's just outlined. They self-evidently have political ones as well. And so, I think we'll probably see the government try to do something to nod to those issues. At the risk of sounding like the kind of conservative curmudgeon, though, just to respond directly to your question, I mean, the only way through lower inflation is through. And, one of the reasons governments have been so careful for the past 40 years on trying to minimize the risk of rising inflation is precisely because getting out of it is so painful, both for households and typically for governments.
Okay, so there's two ideas, though, that are being floated around, and none of you jumped at them. So, Jennifer.
All right.
Right. One of the things that could happen is that Chrystia Freeland could walk over to the Bank of Canada and emerge with Tiff Macklem and say, we've decided that it is in the best interest of the Canadian economy that the new target is 3%, not 2%. And this allows rates to come down.
Okay. So as somebody I was talking to or emailing with, I can't remember which now, it's all blurred, was saying the other day, we're all in Tiff's hands now. So yeah, to some degree, I think, and this builds on what Tyler and Sean were saying, that fundamentally, the way through is going to depend in part on what the bank decides to do. I would say, though, for Chrystia Freeland, the minister, to march over and sort of even arm in arm with a voluntary TIF to do that would be disastrous in terms of the apparent politicization of the institution at the Bank of Canada. I think we've already seen kind of enough towing right up to that line by premiers, by the minister herself, in a sense. So, look, the Bank of Canada needs to exercise that independence. I think it's an open question as to whether or not they will start to revise their target. Interested to see what happens with the Federal Reserve, because I think that might basically create the permissive conditions, right, for Canada to follow suit. I will say, interestingly enough, I was in my local bank a couple of weeks ago, and at least on some of their products and services, the banks are already pricing in rate cuts for next spring, which I find really interesting. And so, yeah, we want those rates to at least stabilize and come down. But I think there's, in terms of addressing those supply side challenges, you and Sean are not wrong, right? We're not going to be able to build enough houses in the very near term to meaningfully bring down those prices. And let's be honest as well. There is an intergenerational equity issue here, and the fact that an awful lot of older Canadians view their housing equity as a huge part of their retirement security. You're counting yourself among those. Okay.
100%.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I hear you.
100%. I want the kids to get a house, but not at my expense, by God.
I just inject. Oh, sorry, Jen.
No, go ahead.
No, well, just as a stat on the Bank of Canada point, because if you chart what's happened with inflation over the course of the last, basically 30 odd years from 1994, more or less, to pre-COVID. What happened with inflation, if you look at 2% having been the target that we all say we want to achieve, but remember, there's also the control range, right? Which is somewhere between 1 and 3, right? So we want to be at 2, but if we're between 1 and 3, that's okay. And if you look at how
everybody's ignoring the 3, though, Tyler.
Well,
everybody's ignoring the 3.
So tell me what you think after I say this. So between that period of time, it took about 75% of the time, Canada had inflation somewhere between 1 and 3%. So we were within the control range. But the number of times that we actually hit the 2% target, and if you give some allowance for being a bit below or a bit above by about 20 basis points, give or take, we only hit that 22% of the time in that period of time. So my point is, we talk about 2% as the holy grail. We actually don't really hit it all that much. And so I kind of am in the camp of just saying, well, we have a control range, that should be success. I wouldn't go and change the actual definition of the target. I think the bank just needs some.
But it's been 3.1 or something, wasn't it, Tyler? I'm sorry, hasn't the overall rate of inflation been like 3.1 and the rates don't move?
It's gone up and down, right? So we actually were in a period earlier this year where we were below 3%. So we were even within the control range. And then we saw inflation tick back up and there was a threat of reopening interest rate hikes again. I think the bank probably wants some more time to be able to see that is meaningfully trending down in the right direction. And I think that's probably the right call. All I would just say is, we need to have some flexibility about how we interpret what success is, because past history would suggest, even as we talk about how great the 2% target is, we actually don't achieve the 2% target all that much.
Sean, Corey tonight, among other people, has been making the argument on the curse of politics that there's too much inflation in the world now to hit a 2% target, that between the wars that are going on and between the collapse of globalization and supply chains, that there is an inherent amount of inflation that means that 2% is now the wrong target. And I would also add to this conversation that Mr. Chrétien and Martin fired a Bank of Canada governor upon taking office because that person was being too strict on inflation, and the markets did not go crazy.
Yeah, I would add to the list of factors which may cause higher levels of higher rates of inflation than we've experienced in, say, the past 10 or 15 years. I would add to that our efforts to re-engineer the industrial economy. That is inherently going to put upward pressure on prices for the foreseeable future, and that's a kind of trade-off that we've collectively decided is important in the name of climate, reducing the effects of climate change. So I think there is a world where it kind of comes back to my observation about deficits. Zero isn't a magic number, but it's useful to have an anchor, and an anchor that markets and consumers and voters and businesses and others have confidence the government is genuinely committed to. I think the same goes for inflation. So I would be reluctant, David, I would have an apprehension to the scenario that you outlined, which is just in the middle of a term in terms of the inflation targeting regime, to go over there and just kind of change it. But if I was the government, pre-positioning that when the current agreement with the Bank of Canada is up, it's going to think seriously about making adjustments to the inflation targeting regime. And not only do I think that that's totally credible and possibly justifiable, it is fundamentally how the elected arm of government ought to influence Bank of Canada policy, right, and interest rate choices. So I think Tyler will remind us of the current state of that agreement. I'm afraid I don't recall where it stands. It's typically for about 5 years, right, Tyler?
That's right. So it was signed at the end of 2021 in December, so that they actually don't have to renew it or review it until 2026 or so, 2027. But what's interesting is they usually start the process feeding in consultations and research, usually about 1 to 2 years in advance of that. So to Sean's point, if they wanted to, they could use 2024 and 2025 as a starting point for that discussion.
Interesting. Okay, so the other affordability option that none of you have leapt at is to remove the carbon tax on consumer purchases and leave it only on the industrial, but take it off of consumer. How devastating would that be to our climate objectives? Anybody know the answer to that?
Well, estimates are, I'll answer the substance first, and then maybe step back and talk more about the ideas and politics inherent in your question. I think as a matter of our emissions reductions, it would be a manageable change. The carbon tax, broadly defined, the consumer side and the industrial side, represents something like 30% of projected emissions reductions between now and 2030. I'm afraid, David, that I don't know the relative share of the consumer part and the industrial part, but the combined total is about 25 or 30%. So if you back out the consumer carbon tax and you still are committed to our ambitious goals around meeting our emissions reductions, then you're going to have to offset that with some other mix of policies. And I mean, this is not an abstract point. This is the conundrum facing the Conservative Party, right? They have essentially, as I've come to think of it, a gap problem. They have to try to get to either 40% or 30% or whatever target they're going to use to underpin their policy between now and 2030. They're removing certain measures off the table, including the consumer carbon tax and possibly the clean fuel standard and others. And the question is, what's the mix of policies that enables them to essentially fill that gap? My understanding is that there are options available to them that would enable them to close that gap. But I think what a lot of critics would say is that they're more costly, least efficient, et cetera. But the point is, in a narrow response to your question, it's a manageable in terms of meeting our emissions. What I would say, though, as someone who spent time in policy and politics, I'd be interested in Tyler's response to this. I mean, that would be a tough change for the government. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's one of its key policymaking legacies is making the kind of intellectual and evidentiary-based case for the carbon tax, having sustained it through 2 subsequent elections. And to discard it now at a moment when, I mean, to be honest, it looks like the prospects for the government are pretty dim. It would be like abandoning such a key legacy item for rewards that are not self-evident to me. And so that's how I kind of think about that question.
Yeah, but it's kind of like hanging on to the barbaric practice of snitch line or something, because it's going to be gone after the election. Like, it is not. You can say it's our legacy, and we're going to hang on to it to defend our legacy, but it will be gone after the election, because Poilievre is going to kill it. And Jennifer, to sort of lead into this point, I mean, you talked about establishing confidence among consumers and changing the mindset of consumers out there. I find it implausible that the government will be able to convince people it's helping them on the affordability front, when it now seems to be conventional wisdom that its signature policy is exacerbating the affordability challenge.
I don't know that it is.
It may not be in reality, but I think that's now the perception.
Okay, but
which has been fed by the government's actions in Atlantic Canada.
Well, okay, exactly. Fair. That was an own goal, for sure. When the available evidence seems to be that you would get, kind of a one-time reduction in terms of inflation, but really that it's a very small sliver, right? That the carbon price is actually contributing to. So I think to Sean's point, it's like, what would you get for it, right? Like you cancel this, you walk it back, you eat all of the political crow, and you actually don't move the dial all that much in terms of affordability pressures. So why, right? And I think to Sean's point as well, it's a question of, okay, so if you do cancel it, it's what are the costs and effective. What is the cost and what's the likely effectiveness of the replacement measures that you have to put in, right, in terms of like heavy regulation, expensive subsidies, all this sort of stuff. And I would also point out all of those things have non-trivial implementation runways that they would need, right? The carbon price is easier to adjust up and down, right? It's there, it exists. So all of this to say, I think it would be a bad idea, obviously, to cancel it. That said, is there more that could be done in terms of looking at the modeling and the assumptions that are baked into the climate action incentive, right? Is that maybe time for another look and a review? Are the top-ups for rural Canadians appropriate? Are the top-ups by income level adequate? That kind of thing. I think there's something that could be done there that would be more consistent with both climate goals as well as addressing affordability.
Okay.
Say, if we get rid of the retail component will also likely get rid of the rebates, right? Because those two things go together. And so if households will lose, and some households who are getting more, a substantial number of households who are getting more back will lose money. So if the goal is to improve affordability, we will not achieve that objective. We may make people feel better politically, but they will actually have less cash. Many of them will have less cash in their pocket because of that choice. And I don't know that that's a very good argument. In fact, I think it gives the Prime Minister something to work with. Just one other thing, and Sean, it sounds like you want to get in on this. I will just say the consequence of removing the retail component is that it will then mean we will have to probably do more on the industrial price side. And the interesting question here for Pierre is, so you get rid of the retail component, sure, but you're probably either going to maintain or increase the industrial price, much in the same way Danielle Smith and Doug Ford have tried to do. And what's interesting about that, if you think about a national unity perspective, is Ontario is far more weighted in its emissions profile to retail than it is to industrial. And so if we end up with that result, one, it'll be more inefficient in terms of policymaking across the country, because we'll have to do more sectorally and more regionally to adjust these things to achieve the same emissions reductions. But two, it'll actually also mean that Alberta may end up paying more relatively in terms of its weight.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on Tyler's point about the extent to which the carbon tax package, the tax itself, but combined with the incentive, is progressive. I think this is actually Canadians who are lamenting their kind of affordability challenges. I even think the media and others who follow these issues pretty closely. I encountered, David, how progressive the carbon tax package was when I helped Jason Kenney a bit in the preparations to the 2018 election. And when you started to unwind the two sides, you discovered that, in a way, if you think about it, the carbon tax package as enacted by the Trudeau government was basically a progressive transfer, obscured or presented as a climate action. I don't know, Tyler, I'll turn it to you to talk a bit about, but my sense is it's probably actually one of the most progressive things the government has done. I just didn't mean in terms of the income distribution of its various choices. Now, as a conservative, I'm actually not all that fussed about the distributional effects. But I was surprised to discover that this was, kind of in a way, I don't want to overstate this, but like left-wing social policy done under the guise of addressing climate change.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right about that. And what's interesting is, if I were to look at this case study years from now, assuming that the retail component is taken off by a future Conservative government, one of the issues we might want to look at in that case study would be, does the inability to have administered it properly, i.e., as in it's not visible to people, it doesn't therefore have the impact of people understanding how progressive it is in the way that a Canada Child Benefit check arriving in your hands and having been advertised as aggressively as it was, is well understood and probably will survive a political change in government. And I would just say, if that thesis is correct, it says a lot about the administrative hurdles that CRA and the Department of Finance have put up in implementing this thing, that may in fact be at the heart of how difficult it is to actually make sure that it's sustained.
Right. Okay. So redistribution left wing, Sean says. What are you expecting about pharmacare in this fall economic statement? I mean, the NDP came out of their convention saying this was now the sine qua non of their relationship. This was the thing that had to happen. And the government talks about a framework, which doesn't sound to me like a policy. Sounds something different than that. Does anybody see any prospect that there's a pharmacare program between now and the next election? And what will happen in this fall economic statement to kick that off?
Seems unlikely, to be perfectly frank. I mean, there is no path forward on a pharmacare program that does not run through provincial capitals. And it does not seem like there is an enormous appetite for that right now. I mean, a framework can be a lot of things. A framework can be a planned plan. I suppose they could do that. Plans to plan generally don't need to come with big dollar values. So that, that kind of kicks the can down the road for a little bit. I could imagine something like that in the fall economic statement. Will that be enough to satisfy the NDP? I don't know. I wasn't at their convention. I'm not in their caucus, but it's not abundantly clear to me that this is the thing that polls so darn well. And I mean, I defer to folks like Tyler and Sean, who probably have more insight on this, but and to you too, David, you would know more about the public response on this issue. It just seems to me like is this the affordability issue that people are really gunning for relative to other cost pressures that they are feeling?
The only thing I'd add, I mean, in addition to the obvious fiscal pressures that a full national pharmacare proposal would represent, I also think there are coalitional dynamics within a modern big L liberal politics, which don't make it, in my mind, a self-evident slam dunk. I mean, one thing that Tyler and the Trudeau government have done a pretty extraordinary job of over the past several years is bringing within its coalition a lot of traditional labor, which of course used to be the domain of the New Democratic Party. If you belong to a union, either in the public sector or the private sector, there's a high probability that you have employer-provided health and dental benefits, and probably pretty good ones for that. And so, it's not obvious to me that if you look at the Liberal Party's electoral coalition and you graph that onto the share of the population that doesn't currently have pretty generous health and dental benefits, the Venn diagram would be pretty complete in my mind. So in that sense, it's not obvious. I mean, there may be kind of ideological or philosophical reasons you might want to do this, but from a pretty crass political one, I don't think these are the types of people that currently are part of today's Liberal Party of Canada.
Tyler,
yes.
do you think the government has been surprised by the lack of political benefit from the childcare and dental programs, and how might that play into its attitude about pharmacare?
Yes, I think that's a very fair issue, and it's true that if you ranked Pierre and Trudeau on different issues and who's seen as best on different issues, the two things that the Prime Minister currently leads on are climate change and childcare, and so he's gotten some benefit out of it, but he's not gotten a huge amount of benefit out of childcare, and I think there's still more to be done to try to push that point. But what's interesting about pharmacare, right? And David, you would know this because you do a lot with public opinion research. As far as I can tell, it's a low priority issue for Canadians. It's not a thing that people say I want or need. And if you are in the small group of people who aren't covered or adequately covered today, it's not clear that group is big enough to be able to move numbers. It's a huge dollar cost investment if we go with a single payer system. Not that we shouldn't necessarily, but relative to the political benefit in the time that the government has left, I think it's hard to make a case that this is where you should be putting your dollars. The challenge is, of course, that the NDP has put their chips down on this issue, and I think we're gonna see a decision point. Either the NDP will have to step back from the supply and confidence agreement and say this was not achieved in the way that we desired, and so we will continue to vote on a issue by issue basis. And that may not be the worst thing in the world for either the NDP or the Liberals, or the government commits itself to something that they can get on board with. And if I had to think about how you would construct something that threads the needle around not overspending in this space and still gives the NDP a potential win, the way I would probably want to do it would be to say, I'm going to create a piece of legislation that has a series of base level conditions, and then I'm going to allow the Minister of Health to go and negotiate agreements with provinces. And you might get an early agreement with a province like British Columbia because they have an NDP government and they're interested, and maybe Manitoba as well. But you wouldn't force yourself having to take the cost of running a national program in all jurisdictions right out of the gate. And fiscally, that would be, I think, potentially manageable. But look, as I say, I'm not sure that the squeeze is worth the juice here.
May I raise something, David? Because Tyler, for the first time, approximately an hour in, Tyler has raised the prospect of a federal election. And one of the challenges that the Conservative Party of Canada faces in preparing for a possible federal election is what I've come to think of as a fiscal trilemma. Bear with me. It's a bit wonky, but I actually think it has important political implications.
Is this a new way of betting? A trilemma?
Exactly. In the current fiscal context, it seems to me in the development of a conservative platform, the party has to choose two of three things. It can have new incremental measures to try to appeal to Canadians. It can commit itself to balanced budgets, and it can avoid incorporating spending cuts in its platform. But you can only choose two of those three things. In 2015, Stephen Harper essentially chose that he wouldn't have any new incremental positive measures to try to appeal to Canadians. There was the plan was rooted in a balanced budget. It didn't incorporate any new proposed spending cuts, but that placed real constraints on the ability to match the Liberals on child benefits or tax cuts or infrastructure, et cetera. And so that is one of the, Tyler works with Ken Bosencool. Ken likes to go around and tell everyone that the 2006 Conservative platform was genius, and it had all of these really popular measures like a GST cut, wait time guarantee that involved incremental funding to the provinces. I'm even forgetting all of the various proposals inherent in that platform. But you'll recall, David, it was conceived of in an era of double-digit billion-dollar surpluses. There was no constraints. There was no trade-offs. I suspect we could
It was just one of the five most popular things. You could have written that thing on a napkin in a restaurant. Anybody could have.
And so I think this trilemma faces a real challenge for the Conservatives, in part because, I think it's been alluded earlier, there's not a lot of appetite right now in the public for spending cuts. On the other hand, balanced budgets, to the extent that there are some pretty core precepts within big C conservative politics these days, I think balanced budgets would be amongst them. But of course, going into a campaign saying we're not going to have anything, there's nothing inherent in our program, it's just a non-starter, especially since, as we discussed earlier, if the party is going to have a credible climate plan, it's actually probably going to have to spend a lot of dough, given that it's taken carbon taxes off the table. So each party has its own challenges with respect to the kind of economic and fiscal picture. But this fiscal trilemma is one that I suspect Conservatives are spending a lot of time trying to work through right now. And if we have an election, as Tyler is speculating, those challenges or that test will become even more critical in the moment. Okay,
Sean, let me stay with you for a sec because I want to. We are at an hour mark. I've got a few things I want to get through here. And one of the things I want to, it's a provocative statement, but I want to get people's reaction to it because I kind of feeling it these days, which is between the government's Atlantic Canada admission that the carbon tax has negative implications on affordability and between the Bank of Canada saying that public sector spending is challenging its task in reducing inflation. What part of Poilievre's theory of the case does he have wrong?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One, he hasn't articulated that vision for growth that you talked about earlier. It's fair enough to make these observations about the carbon tax and about what I would describe as the kind of excessive growth in the size and scope of the federal government over the past several years. But he still needs to articulate that growth vision that we talked about. And then I come back to the point I made. Pierre Poilievre is an Ottawa area member of parliament. And so he knows as well as anyone the local political consequences of, for lack of a better term, austerity. And so I think, the Liberals are going to criticize the Conservatives for having a plan for austerity, even if they don't have one. I think that's a pretty predictable part of the upcoming election campaign, and how he squares the circle between, on one hand, criticizing the government's deficits and debt, and on the other hand, avoid being boxed into a characterization of him being austere is going to be a challenge for him and the Conservative Party.
Jennifer, I just reiterate, it looks to me like he's been right all along. Contradict me.
Okay. Well, a couple of things. I like Sean's framework of the trilemma,
Yeah.
and I think he's absolutely right that the way that Stephen Harper was able to square that in 2015 was only because he had already been the government, right? So he was essentially running on no new stuff, but if you like what you've had, like we'll just keep doing that. And Polliver doesn't have that flexibility. What is he wrong on? There has been one that I can find so far. One clear, detailed statement of what he would do differently if in office, right? There's sort of the hand wavy, cancel the retail carbon tax, details to follow in terms of what we would do instead. There's fire the Bank of Canada. Oh no, actually I don't want to talk about that anymore. And there's been this one private members bill that he's put forward, which is like, it's the synthesis of his, build homes, not bureaucracy, common sense approach on addressing housing supply. And I think it's been good politics for him, for sure. But the part that I think he's gotten wrong is that the feasibility of what he's proposing is not there. So in the sense of being a clear government in waiting with practical, affordable, reasonable, like non-scary, right? Like not austerity, but also effective policy responses, I don't see it yet. Right. I'm not saying it's impossible that he'll get there. But that's, I think, also another challenge that he's really facing.
Why, Jennifer?
But understanding the problem when you're a politician and people think you understand the problem, you're 70% of the way there. Right. And if they don't think you understand the problem, you can announce policy till you're bleeding and it won't matter. Right. So, Tyler, it looks like Poilievre got it. And the government has to keep denying what he says, even though it feels right to people.
You're on mute.
Yeah. Oh. No, you're good now.
Sorry. I'm not sure that he got it in the sense of the substance and the policy. I think Jen's point about the housing bill is spot on, because in fact, if you look at that, ironically, if you look at the bill, one of the areas of the bill on the removal of GST on purpose-built rental, his plan is actually worse than the government's plan. It would be more bureaucratic and more limited in terms of what it would support in the marketplace than what the government is proposing to do, which is take it off.
But if you follow that logic, I understand what you're saying, but then isn't that, what's interesting isn't the argument that the government and Poilievre are making the same mistake? They're just making it in different parts of their plan. That is to say, Poilievre, the center of Poilievre's plan is less bureaucratic, less top down than the government's. But you're right, with respect to GST, he wants the GST reduction. He wants to be more prescriptive in a way that is incoherent with the way he thinks and talks about the issue more generally. But then the government is making the same mistake, but just in the opposite direction. Its GST cut, HST cut is more flexible, broader, more neutral. But the way it's going about trying to persuade and incentivize municipalities to liberalize their land use rules is more top-down, more centralized, more bureaucratic.
I kind of agree with that. But what I would say is that what Pierre has gotten right is his consistency of message. What he has gotten wrong is I don't think he's as invested or cares about the details as much as probably he should at this point in time. Because I think if we go back to the 2014-15 period when Justin Trudeau looked to be in a very similar position to Pierre Poilievre, right, who was, Justin Trudeau was kind of first in the polls. There was this sense of expectation that he was going to replace the prime minister. He was getting big crowds across the country. One of the things that Justin Trudeau did very effectively was he used policy to reinforce why he was a safe choice, and like very detailed policy to the point that it could go toe to toe with the Department of Finance, right, on things like the Canada Child Benefit. I don't think Pierre's there. I don't know that he needs to be there necessarily, because I think there's just it's an anger and a frustration that's largely as a wave pushing him. But if I were conservatives, I'd be thinking about how do I actually show my policy chops to show that I can actually do this. And I think the government's problem on the opposite side is that they have not had a consistent message about what they are trying to do. And they have felt more like they are being pulled around on issues. And when they have come to trying to solve some of this stuff, especially on housing in the last couple of months, they've actually been very good. They've been very aggressive. Sean Fraser is doing a very good job. But I just think Pierre is benefiting right now from having had the consistency of message so that when that Overton window, that political window opens, people give credit to the guy who's been saying the same thing over and over.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what Jennifer and Tyler have said is when you think, if you think about what, if anything, you'd advise the Conservatives to put out sooner rather than later. That is to say, which part, David and I have contributed to a new book. I think we can plug it here on the Common Sense Revolution, and Mike Harris's record in office. And of course, they released that platform, the full platform, approximately a year before the election. Just in parentheses, this is for like another conversation, maybe another one of your podcasts, David. One of the consequences of releasing it so early is it was before anyone besides incumbent MPPs had been nominated. So in effect, candidates who stood for election under the Progressive Conservative banner were kind of self-selecting or opting into the plan, which is, I think, kind of interesting and maybe something to think about. But I sort of set that aside. There's been a tendency at the national level in the past several election cycles not to do that, not to get out, for opposition parties to get out that far in advance with their fully developed policy plan. I think the one exception, if I was advising Pierre Poilievre, would be the climate agenda. This is a shield issue for them. In some ways, the change the government has made to the carbon tax minimizes the difference between the two sides. And if I was advising the Conservatives, I would get that out, I don't know when precisely, but well in advance of the election to try to, in effect, set that issue aside, hug the government close, secure the kind of endorsements you need that your plan is sufficiently credible, and then move on to prosecuting the case on the issues that we've been talking about today.
Right. So, Tyler, my last question is this. All of the polls show that the government is at a very significant disadvantage to the Conservatives when it comes to anything regarding the economy. In my view, from campaign history, the gap is too large for the Liberals to currently win. They have to reclaim some economic territory. Is there an alternative thesis that can be convincing to people about jobs and growth? Because that's what I think. I don't think it's fiscal responsibility. I don't think it's business climate. I don't think it's any of those things that we have to win on. I think it's jobs and growth that Liberals have to be competitive or winning on. And is there, within what the government's been doing and what tools are available to it, a compelling story about a centrist approach to jobs and growth?
So I'm going to agree, but also disagree with your thesis a little bit. So I actually don't think that governments get elected or get pushed out of office entirely on the question of the economy. Sometimes that happens, but certainly if, again, we look at what happened in the period of time in which Justin Trudeau won, if you were to poll on election day, Stephen Harper was either even or still ahead on the question of who was best for the economy, who was best manager of the economy. But the thing that Justin Trudeau did very effectively, which I think is actually how people, when they decide to vote, how they conflate the economy in a way that we don't pick up sometimes in polls, is on the question of who is, which party is making decisions or putting out ideas that is in the best interest of you, that is on your
side. That's what I was trying to focus in on with the not business climate, not fiscal, but right.
That's right. That's right. And so I think, and I haven't seen someone track that question of late, but I would bet you that the government is behind on that question. And I think what they need to do as a lens is think about on every single decision that they have in a budget 2024, in a potential budget 2025, and in other opportunities, how are we delivering things that are going to tangibly show people that we are on their side, right? And here's an example of it, right? When they announced the change on the retail carbon price, or part of the retail carbon price, as it relates to home heating oil, they expanded a program to get heat pumps in people's hands. If we were to expand that nationally and to not rely on having it go through the provinces, we could actually in the next 2 years get some stuff in people's hands that would significantly reduce their energy bills. If you want to show that you're on the side of people, reducing their energy bills in a way that still maintains an active focus on addressing climate change would be a really good thing to do. So I just think we have to focus on what are the tangible kinds of things that we can deliver for people. It's not going to come entirely from, cutting more ribbons at a Stellantis plant or cutting more ribbons at a VW plant. That's helpful. It sends a narrative that the government cares about jobs, but those jobs are also not going to get filled in the near future, right? So it's got to be on some tangible things that address some of the cost pressures that are faced in the household budget.
Yes, Jennifer? Give us the center-left economic pitch right now.
So, look, I think that Tyler is on to something with this in the sense of, yet again, another sort of pocketbook election, right? The direct government to consumer, that's the connection, right? And if you can give me the things that I can see and that feel like they're responding to my needs, that'll be important. I think he's on to something there. At the same time, I think there is a broader question of, my sense is that, yes, polling on the economy, right, and jobs, right, bounces up and down depending on how people think the economy is going, right, in terms of the order of priority and preference. And that's, if I remember correctly, like basically healthcare, economy, and environment, those kind of compete for sort of top space. I think you have to show that
the climate is the NDP of that threesome, by the way. It's
You're saying, David, it's a fickle friend?
No, I'm saying it's a fraction of the other two.
It's always a bridesmaid, never a bride. Okay. But I think that there is still something to having a package that makes it clear that you are competent economic managers who care about the overall framework, right? That are not frightening to Bay Street, that you get it, basically, right? As somebody I once talked to said, businesses don't vote. Yeah, but you know what? You have to show that you're actually not a, scary, incompetent government with regards to the business community. That said, I think in addition to, Tyler gave the example of programs that could put heat pumps or make the heat pump subsidy more directly available without going through provinces. I get it, right? That there is a desire at the federal level to find the programs and services that create the direct connection to your voters, right? Conservatives did this for a long time, for example, through a series of tax credit measures, right? You file your taxes and you see all these nice little things, right, that show up on your return that remind you that the government cares about you and shares your values of putting your kids in soccer and taking the bus and that kind of thing, right? What I worry about, though, is that if we go down that route, the desire for the visibility can override attention to the program design and service delivery, right? And making sure that this is actually done in a way that, number one, makes any sense. Number two, that people who actually need the help can get it. I'll just use this as an example. The heat pump program that does exist right now, it's income tested. The one and only way that you can get your income tested for this program is by filing a tax return. If you don't file a tax return, no heat pump for you, right? So there's all these other terribly unsexy parts to making these measures actually workable. And I think at the end of the day, I think citizens care about service delivery, right? And feeling like when they show up, for example, the passport office, they can get a passport. I think they care about, when they say, actually, this heat pump incentive is interesting to me, that it's not an administrative nightmare to try and get it. So I would just say, I get it. Elections are won and lost on the sexier stuff, but there has to be some thinking and some plan behind how do you do the implementation so that this will actually work.
All right, Sean, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to put it in this terms to you. 2015, Trudeau does not get elected on climate change. And Trudeau does not get elected on social policy. Trudeau gets elected on economic policy. Trudeau gets elected on the basis of this economy is shitty for you, and I'm going to make it better. If you're in the middle class or if you want to be in the middle class, you're not getting the economic outcomes you need. And we're going to change that. We're going to change that through growing this economy. We're going to invest in infrastructure. We're going to do all. They had a jobs and growth narrative that allowed them to win in 2015. Now it sounds to me like their message is, we'll try to shield you from the shitty economy, not that we will change the shitty economy. How do they get back into the we will change the shitty economy narrative?
Yeah, I think that's right. In some ways, I think the story, I say this with great respect. I think some ways, one of the mistakes the Trudeau government has made over the years is it actually misinterpreted that outcome. That, as you say, it was elected precisely because it kind of leaned into, what was a kind of almost center right message. The instruments themselves may have been progressive or whatever, but they were meeting Canadians. They were matching Stephen Harper on those core issues. And I think in a way they came to misinterpret that as that they had a mandate for something different, something more ideological, something that went beyond a mandate around, as you say, jobs and growth. I think that's where this government has got itself into trouble at times. The question now is, can it get back to that, David? And what I would say, again, respectfully, I don't think it comes from announcing a new ream of incremental measures. As I said at the outset, the problem for this government isn't that they don't have a lot of programs and policies. In some ways, it's because they have too many of them, that it's hard for Canadians to kind of connect the dots between all of the disparate things that this frenetic government has done over the past several years. I don't think this is going to be one with heat pumps. I think it's actually going to require something more bigger picture and something more radical. The party is down, 15 points in the polls. I think if I was sitting around the table, in the absence of something more radical, something more transformational relative to what they've done over the past several years, I think it will be pretty hard to close the gap. What that looks like, I defer to Tyler and Jennifer, but I would be thinking about something massive. Collapsing the income tax system, or something like that to sort of match the moment. And I'm afraid one of the consequences of being in government of a long time is you kind of lose that muscle in a way. Tyler talked about how ambitious the 2015 platform was for the Liberal Party. Over time, I think it was Henry Kissinger who said you draw down on intellectual capital in government, you don't build on. And I think there's something to that for the Trudeau government.
Well, there's also governmentitis, right? I mean, they came in on a slogan of better is always possible, right? And now it's like every day they say to you, don't you fucking understand how difficult it is to make things better? Right?
Well, actually, they seem to be largely relying on a message of it could have been so much worse if we weren't here, right? Yeah.
David, can I just say in response to Sean's suggestion of ambition and boldness, which I generally always favor, I'm not saying that you should do heat pumps and that will give you success. I'm saying that's just something that's very tangible that I think can help in this current environment. But if they want something big and ambitious that doesn't cost money, competition. We have not done major competition reform in a long time in this country. And let's be very honest, it's the one kind of lever we haven't pulled around how we support innovation, productivity, jobs, and growth. And I think we're at a point now where people are frustrated in a number of industries as they've gone through an inflationary cycle about who they blame for that. In part, some companies are being blamed for that. This would be an area that would be the right policy move and might be a good political move.
Cool. Jennifer, any last thoughts?
Last thoughts. I don't know if there isn't anything we haven't already talked about, right? I mean, like we've kind of boiled the ocean here, haven't we? No?
I have 20 things we never got to.
The only thing I would say, David, were you involved in the 2000 false statement?
I was, yes.
I mean, in a way, if I was advising the government, I would go back and look at that false statement, which was a kind of political realignment false statement, right? You set out this ambitious plan.
It was the pivot to confront the Reform Party politically.
Exactly. And I don't know if this government, it's in this government's kind of DNA to do that kind of pivot. But that would be, the kind of level of ambition or transformation that I was talking about.
At that time, the largest tax cut in Canadian history.
I suspect still the largest.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, not a joyful, but a pragmatic and clear-eyed conversation about Canadian policy in the upcoming fall economic statement. I'm sure since it isn't put to bed yet that the minister will be listening carefully this afternoon to this and maybe making some final alterations. Let's see if there's the largest tax cut in Canadian history in the fall economic statement tomorrow. Thanks all. It's so great for you to this generously share your insights and understanding of these issues. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all the folks out there who watch or listen to this show. Really appreciate your loyalty. We'll see you next week with more of the Herle Burly. In the meantime, take care of yourselves.